Canada may be sitting on something America desperately needs, and the timing could not be worse for Washington. As China keeps its grip on the rare earth supply chain, Canada is becoming harder to ignore. But there is a problem hiding underneath this opportunity. Getting these critical materials from Canadian ground into American weapons may be far harder than anyone expects. These materials are used in electronics, electric motors, advanced machines, and especially permanent magnets. And those magnets are extremely important because they can make machines smaller, lighter, and more powerful. Canada says permanent magnets were the largest global use of rare earth elements in 2024, making up about 48% of total demand. The United States wants to build a stronger supply chain that does not depend so heavily on countries it considers a security risk. The problem is that China has built a huge lead in this industry. China produced about 69% of the world's mined rare earths in 2024. Even more important, China produced about 90% of the world's refined rare earths. Mining the material is only one part of the process. The ore still has to be separated, refined, and turned into useful materials. That processing step is where China's advantage becomes especially powerful. And this is exactly why Canada matters. Canada has more than 15.2 million tons of estimated rare earth oxide resources. That sounds enormous, but there is an important catch. Canada is not yet a commercial producer of rare earth elements. Several projects are being developed, but moving from a large resource in the ground to large-scale production takes years of work, money, processing, technology, and customers. So America cannot simply look at a map, point at Canada, and say, problem solved. The real battle is about building an entire supply chain. That means mines, processing plants, separation technology, magnet production, transportation, and long-term contracts. If even one major part is missing, the material may still have to pass through another country before it reaches a factory. But Washington is clearly treating this problem as a national security issue. A July 2026 White House executive order said U.S. defense supply chains should rely on domestic production or allied nations for critical materials and components. The order also calls for deeper mapping of defense supply chains and pushes contractors to qualify alternative sources when they depend on unreliable foreign suppliers. And if you want the real story behind how Canada is still holding its ground through tariffs, wars, and hard times, hit join below to join the membership for exclusive documentaries you won't see anywhere else about Canada's progress and rise through uncertainty. The United States is no longer looking only for the cheapest rare earths. It is looking for a supply chain it can trust during a crisis. And that can completely change the price. Look at what is already happening inside the US market. S&P Global reported in May that US government-backed price floors for several rare earth materials were set far above Chinese spot market prices. The reported floors were $110 per kilogram for neodymium praseodymium, $2,050 per kilogram for terbium, and $575 per kilogram for dysprosium. The US is trying to build a second system, even if that system costs more. And Canada could become one of the important pieces of that system. Canada is already working with allies on rare earth mining and processing. At the 2026 G7 summit, Canada announced partnerships involving projects in Quebec and Ontario. One agreement involves Torngat Metals and Schneider Electric working on the Strange Lake rare earth project and a separation facility in Quebec. Another involves Eucor Rare Metals and Japan's Sumitomo Corporation with the goal of supplying processed rare earth products to magnet makers in Japan and North America. That means Canada is not simply sitting on valuable rocks. It is trying to build a wider network around those resources. And the timing could not be more important. The U.S. defense industry needs materials for systems that depend on advanced electronics, magnets, communications, navigation, surveillance, aircraft, ships, and weapons. The White House has specifically identified processed critical minerals as important to the defense industrial base and military readiness. The real question is whether Canada can develop enough mining and processing capacity quickly enough to become a major alternative supplier, and whether America is willing to pay a higher price to make that supply secure. Because if Washington chooses security over cheap Chinese supply, The rare earth market could be entering a completely different era, and Canada may be sitting much closer to the center of it than most people realize. The biggest mistake would be thinking this is only a story about Canada and the United States. It is much bigger than that. Japan and European countries are also trying to secure rare earth supplies outside China. That matters because the same materials are needed by many of the world's biggest technology and manufacturing industries. When several countries compete for a limited amount of non-Chinese supply, prices can rise quickly. This is where the 30% more expensive part of the story needs careful attention. There is evidence of sharp price increases for some individual rare earth materials, but there is not enough evidence to say that all Canadian rare earths suddenly became 30% more expensive. That distinction matters. The stronger story is that Western supply can cost much more than Chinese supply because companies are paying for new mines, new processing plants, new factories, and a safer supply chain. And that premium could become even more important if China tightens control over exports. China has already shown that rare earths can become a powerful economic tool. When export rules become stricter, companies outside China have to find new suppliers, and that can create a sudden rush for alternative materials. For defense companies, the problem is even more serious because they cannot simply wait for prices to fall when the material is needed for critical military systems. This creates a huge opportunity for Canada. The country has large mineral resources, strong ties with the United States, and close relationships with other major allies. Canada is also trying to attract investment into critical mineral projects. In March 2026, the Canadian government said it had secured 30 new critical minerals partnerships and helped unlock $12.1 billion in mining project capital. That shows how quickly the country is trying to turn its mineral resources into actual industrial capacity. But there is still a major obstacle. A mine does not automatically create a secure supply chain. Rare earth ore has to be processed into separate elements, and those elements may then need to be turned into metals, alloys, and magnets. Each step requires specialized equipment, trained workers, money, energy, and time. If Canada develops the mine but does not develop enough processing capacity, the country could still depend on foreign facilities before the material becomes useful to American manufacturers. China's advantage was not created overnight. It was built through decades of investment in mining, refining, processing, manufacturing, and supply chain networks. Trying to rebuild those capabilities in North America will not be cheap. It also will not happen instantly. This is why the United States is working with allies instead of relying only on new American mines. And there's another problem. Defense demand is not the only source of competition. Electric vehicles, wind turbines, industrial motors, robotics, electronics, and other technologies also use rare earth materials. That means a supply shortage can affect both military and civilian industries at the same time. Imagine what happens if a major supplier suddenly restricts exports while demand is rising. Companies would race to secure whatever alternative supply they can find. Long-term contracts would become more valuable. New mines could become strategically important even before they reach full production. And suppliers outside China could gain much more bargaining power.